Since when have we had computers? In this presentation, I would like to talk about how computers started, as well as the people who made that possible. There are a few possible starting points, but I will start here. The weaving loom. What is a weaving loom? It's the machine we use to make our clothes, as well as other fabrics. How does the weaving loom work? By passing a long thread, called the weft, over and under the many long threads of the warp, we create a cloth. Using the over and under pattern in interesting ways, we can even add nice designs to our cloth. But this can be very difficult, and it takes a lot of time. Here is an example of such a complex design. By carefully passing the thread over and under in the right way, the weaver can make flowers and houses and birds and even letters to spell words. This design has thousands of threads. It's very easy to make a mistake. Mr. Jacquard thought, I know a better way. He invented a special loom. This loom had paper cards. On these cards he made holes. These holes made the threads move up and down in just the right way to create the design. Making designs became easy because they could be written easily on paper. Charles Babbage saw Mr. Jacquard's loom and thought, I can use this idea to make even more difficult patterns, mathematical patterns. The patterns that Mr. Babbage wanted to create are called logarithms. Logarithms were very important. People needed them to sail ships around the world. But if there were even a small mistakes, ships could get lost or sink in the ocean. In those days, logarithms had to be calculated by hand. This was very difficult work. So who did all those calculations? Computers, but not the kinds of computers we know today. In those days, the computers were people, mostly women. Computers had to calculate every day for many hours without making mistakes. This is what it looked like when computers were working, doing their calculations. Even though the computers were very careful and always double-checked their work, mistakes still slipped through. Mr. Babbage decided that a machine could do a better job, and he got to work making such a machine, called the difference engine. But he never finished. Why not? Because while he was making this machine, he came up with an even better idea. The difference engine would have been good for calculating logarithms. But Mr. Babbage realized that if he added Mr. Jacquard's paper cards to his machine, he would be able to do many more things. He called this new machine the analytical engine. He told Ada Lovelace about his idea. She became fascinated by this machine, which still did not exist. After hearing Mr. Babbage talk about his machine, Ada realized that someone would need to design the patterns to put on the paper cards. She wrote down her ideas about how to make the analytical engine work. This became the first program. But there was no machine. What would that machine have looked like? Nobody is quite sure. Mr. Babbage wrote down many diagrams and plans, but he was not very good at finishing things. This picture gives you an idea. Mr. Babbage was not thinking small. Even so, Ada kept thinking about the things the machine might do. She realized that such a machine might be good, not just for creating mathematical patterns, but other patterns as well. Scientific patterns, or maybe even music. Ada was the first computer programmer. But what is a program? Most machines are made especially to do one thing, just one thing. A toaster makes toast. A coffee maker makes coffee. But because computers have programs, we can change the programs. And when we change the program, it changes what the computer does. At this point, our story takes another turn. Mr. Babbage never finished his machine, so the world still had no computers. When war broke out, the kinds of patterns people needed changed. Now they needed to send secret encoded messages. The Germans had the best secret codes, made by the Enigma machine. When the Germans attacked Britain, the British became desperate. If only there was a way to read those secret messages, to know what the Germans were up to. Many people worked on this problem, none more important than Alan Turing. Turing understood that what was needed to break the code was a computer. But he didn't have one. He tried to invent one, but there wasn't time. Still, the Brits managed to break the codes. It was hard work, but it was all kept secret. Even many years after the war, no one knew who the code breakers were and how they did it. Turing's story was shown in the movie The Imitation Game. What is the imitation game? Turing's idea is that when people solve a difficult problem, they do it by thinking. If we build a machine that can do the same, is the machine thinking? And how do we know the difference? Turing's answer is that if the machine can truly imitate what people do, it too must be thinking. To decide this question, Turing proposed a game. A person and a computer are hidden. The questioner, C, asks questions to help decide which is which. Did he guess correctly? Since then, many people have tried to make programs that can imitate what people do. But so far, I don't think we are ready to say that any of these machines think, though some have been able to fool people for a time. After the war, peace returned, and people now had more time to think about Turing's ideas. One of the first true computers was the ENIAC machine, built in 1946. It was still quite big, though, and it wasn't very easy to use either. It needed many hundreds of meters of cable. The design of these machines progressed, and they became smaller and easier to use. But in the 1950s, a computer would still fill an entire room. programming such a computer was difficult. It required programmers to translate their ideas into codes that the computer could understand. Grace Hopper decided it would be much better if computers learned to understand our language rather than we learn theirs. She created a special kind of program that takes a human idea and translates it into code that a computer can understand. This kind of program is called a compiler. Hopper also invented a special language that would make it easier to write programs and still allow the compiler to translate it into computer code. This programming language that she helped invent was called COBOL. It made programming computers much easier. Computers continued to improve, but they were still large, expensive, and needed special operators to make them work. And the people who operated those machines continued to be mostly women. As more computers were built, more people learned about them and all the things they could do. Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs thought that it would be really cool if they could afford their own computer. So they decided to build one themselves. And so the Apple I was born. You still had to be a bit of a techie to use a machine like that, though. Jobs insisted that for computers to be truly useful, they needed to be easy enough for anyone to use. A computer for the rest of us, as he called it. And this was the true beginning of the personal computer that we know today. Escape. Stop.